Go down with me to verse number 22, and you'll find these words there. I read from two different interpretations. Matthew's Gospel, chapter number 10, verse number 22. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he who endures to the end will be saved. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he who endures to the end will be saved. Let me read from the NSG version. Don't quit. Don't cave in. It is all well worth it in the end. Don't quit. Don't cave in. It is all well worth it in the end. Let me speak to you briefly from this subject. Never give up. Never give up. No one can force you to quit. You're the only one who can make that decision, so don't. Why? Because the reward for overcoming both in this life and next is so far greater than the adversity or hardship you face. As Jesus said, don't be weary in well-doing, for in due season you will reap if you don't faint or give up. It is all well worth it in the end. And then Jesus foretells a very sad fact that will occur in these latter days. He says in Matthew chapter number 24, verse number 10, many will give up and many will be offended. And even to utter these words must have broken his heart, because people he loves so dearly, those he's given his life for, to purchase their freedom and success, he says will be offended and they will give up. And the sad fact is they don't need to. Why? Because God has given us his power for grace to not only pull us through hardships, but come out far stronger, wiser, and more faithful than before we entered into suffering. Many Christians will quit because they don't have the right perspective, and many will compromise. But I found out to walk with God and to manifest his kingdom and distinguish ourselves for his glory involves moving against the flow of the world's system and the way of doing things. Just because the world is sliding into hell on a banana peel don't mean we have to slide with them. We must be relentless in obeying God and his word and not compromise. And the Apostle Paul foresaw the rough currents of the last days and said to Timothy and to us in Timothy chapter 2, verse number 3, chapter 3, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse number 1, he said to Timothy and he said to us that in the last days it is going to be very difficult to be a Christian. Now, you know, Paul had received 39 stripes 5 different times, was beaten with rods 3 times, was stoned and left for dead, and suffered years in prison. And he had faced hostility and persecution everywhere he went, yet he prophesied that in our time period, it would be more difficult to live for God as a Christian. And then he proceeded to spell it out. He said in 2 Timothy chapter number 3, verses number 2 through 4, that people will be selfish, people will be greedy, boastful, and he says conceited. They will be insulting, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, and irreligious. They will be unkind, merciless, slanderous, violent, and fierce. They will hate the good. They will be treacherous, reckless, and swollen, he says, with pride. They will love pleasure rather than God. So here in our text today, we see that these character traits were also found in Paul's society. And people were selfish. They loved themselves and they loved money. They were unholy and unforgiving. They were slanderous. They were conceited. They were disobedient. They were ungrateful. They were unkind. And Peter had even said on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter number 2, verse number 40, he said, "Be saved from this crooked, perverse, wicked, and unjust generation." So why does Paul single out our generation? Why does he target these traits in describing the most difficult time in history to walk with God? Well, the next verse provides the answer. He says they will act as if they are religious, having a form of godliness, but they will reject the power that could save their very souls. And from these, he said, you ought to turn away from. The great difficulty, Paul says, stems from believers compromising the truth. So the apostle forewarns us that in our time, these last evil days, a large percentage of profession born-again Christians will not stand strong in God's grace. They'll cling to the fact that they are saved by grace, yet they'll reject the power of grace that could set them apart as warriors of the kingdom. These are the ones who put up their oars and stop roaring. And they may be pointed upstream, acting like a Christian, but they flow with the current of this world system. And they are not only self-deceived, but also misleading others and causing many sincere ones to stumble. And this is the difficulty Paul addresses. Why? Because we fight a different battle now. And I believe the greatest battle we face in these latter days is lawlessness. And this lawlessness communicates a salvation without expectation of a changed heart and a changed lifestyle. And that is, we live no differently as Christians than before we were saved. But now we're part of a club. We wear the label of a Christian. We speak our club's language as our party boat heads downstream with the current into hell. But we are no longer relentless in our trust in God and our obedience to his way. And Jesus warns that in the latter days, in Matthew chapter 24, verse number 12 and 13, sin, he says, will be rampant everywhere. And the love of many, he says, will grow cold. But those who endure to the end, he says, will be saved. But wait, sin was rampant when Jesus spoke these very words. So what makes our day so different?